Picture this. You're walking through the opulent halls of a Roman villa perched high above the Mediterranean Sea. The year is 30 AD, and you can hear the gentle lapping of waves against limestone cliffs hundreds of feet below. Marble statues gleam in the afternoon sunlight streaming through massive windows, and the scent of expensive perfumes mingles with sea salt in the warm air. But as you move deeper into this palace of unimaginable luxury, you begin to notice something deeply unsettling. The servants move with nervous, darting glances. Their conversations stop abruptly when footsteps approach, and in the shadows between marble columns, you catch glimpses of scenes that make your blood run cold. Small children dressed in elaborate costumes, their eyes hollow and afraid, being led toward private chambers by men whose names are written in golden letters across the empire. This isn't just any Roman villa. This is Villa Jovis on the island of Capri, and its owner is the most powerful man on earth, Emperor Tiberius Caesar Augustus. What you're witnessing represents one of history's most disturbing examples of absolute power corrupting absolutely. A story so shocking that even ancient Roman historians struggled to put it into words. Before we dive into this forgotten tale of imperial depravity and the innocent lives it destroyed, if you're drawn to the hidden truths that textbooks prefer to forget, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content that pulls back the curtain on history's darkest secrets. Drop a comment below, letting me know where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we can explore these ancient horrors together from across the globe, connected by our shared need to understand how power can transform human beings into monsters. What you're about to hear isn't just another story of Roman excess or imperial cruelty. This is the account of how one man's retreat from responsibility became a nightmare for the most vulnerable members of society. It's the story of how isolation and unlimited authority can twist even the most promising leader into something that defies comprehension. And at the center of it all are the children, some barely old enough to walk, who paid the ultimate price for one emperor's descent into madness. The man who would become the architect of these unspeakable acts wasn't born a monster. Tiberius Claudius Nero started life as what Romans would consider the ideal citizen. Born into one of Rome's most prestigious families, he showed early promise as both a military commander and political leader. His stepfather Augustus, the first Roman emperor, saw such potential in the young man that he adopted him as his heir, setting him on a path that would lead to the most powerful position in the ancient world. During his early career, Tiberius proved himself a capable and honorable leader. He commanded legions across the empire's most dangerous frontiers, securing victories that expanded Roman territory and brought glory to the imperial name. His fellow soldiers respected him, his political allies trusted his judgment, and the Roman people saw in him a worthy successor to the great Augustus. But perhaps most tellingly, the young Tiberius showed genuine care for the welfare of ordinary citizens. He implemented policies that reduced taxation, funded public works projects, and ensured fair treatment for provincials throughout the empire. Ancient sources describe him during this period as thoughtful, measured, and deeply committed to the principles of Roman justice. So what happened? How does a respected military hero and conscientious administrator transform into the kind of person who would commit acts so depraved that they shocked even a society accustomed to imperial excess? The answer lies in a single decision that changed everything. Tiberius's choice to abandon Rome and retreat to the island of Capri. In the year 26 AD, 12 years into his reign as emperor, Tiberius made an announcement that stunned the Roman world. He was leaving the capital, ostensibly for a short vacation, but what began as a temporary retreat became permanent exile. He would never set foot in Rome again. The official reasons for this departure seemed reasonable enough. The emperor was approaching 70 years old, and the constant pressures of governing an empire that stretched from Britain to the Persian Gulf had taken their toll. He spoke of needing rest, of wanting to focus on philosophical studies, of seeking the peace that only island solitude could provide. But those closest truth, the emperor had grown Todd the deeper Tiberius understood to despise the very system he was supposed to lead. The endless political machinations, the constant need to balance competing interests, the suffocating protocols of imperial court life. All of it had worn away at something essential in his character. He wasn't just taking a vacation. He was abandoning his responsibilities to pursue whatever dark desires had been growing in the shadows of his mind. The island of Capri became his private kingdom, a place where Roman law meant only what the emperor decided it meant, where witnesses were few and loyalty could be bought with gold or enforced with violence. Here, far from the oversight of senators and the judgment of citizens, Tiberius began to reveal appetites that would have been unthinkable in the public eye. Villa Jovis, the massive palace complex he constructed on Capri's highest peak, became the stage for horrors that ancient historians could barely bring themselves to describe. Covering over 75,000 square feet and built across multiple terraces carved into the clifftop, this wasn't just a residence, it was a fortress of solitude designed to hide unspeakable secrets. The villa's layout reveals much about its true purpose. Beyond the public areas where official business was conducted, lay a maze of private chambers connected by hidden passages. There were rooms filled with erotic art and sculptures, libraries stocked with the most explicit materials from across the empire, and specially designed spaces that served purposes too disturbing for polite description. But it was the villa's most infamous feature that revealed the true depths of Tiberius's corruption, the elaborate pools and gardens where the emperor indulged his most twisted fantasies. Ancient sources describe areas designed specifically for the exploitation of children, spaces where innocence was systematically destroyed for the entertainment of the most powerful man on earth. The children who found themselves trapped in this nightmare came from across the empire, selected for qualities that had nothing to do with their humanity and everything to do with their vulnerability. Some were slaves purchased from markets where human flesh was bought and sold like livestock. Others were the children of desperate families who had fallen into debt, their young bodies offered as payment for survival. But perhaps most disturbing were those who arrived as supposed guests, the children of provincial governors, wealthy merchants, and ambitious aristocrats, who saw proximity to the emperor as an opportunity for advancement. These parents delivered their own offspring into hell, believing they were securing their family's future while actually condemning their children to experiences that would haunt them for whatever remained of their abbreviated lives. The youngest victims were barely past infancy, selected for their complete helplessness and inability to comprehend what was happening to them. Ancient accounts describe toddlers trained like animals to perform acts that defy description, their natural innocence corrupted in ways that ensured they could never develop into healthy human beings. Tiberius called these youngest victims his little fishes, and the games he devised for them in the villa's pools represent some of the most disturbing documented cases of child exploitation in human history. The details preserved by ancient historians are so graphic that modern scholars struggle to discuss them in academic contexts, yet they must be acknowledged as evidence of how completely power can corrupt the human soul. The emperor's descent into this particular form of evil wasn't sudden. It developed gradually as his isolation from normal human contact deepened. Surrounded only by servants who feared for their lives and visitors who came seeking favor, Tiberius lost touch with any moral framework that might have restrained his worst impulses. On Capri, there were no senators to question his decisions, no citizens to witness his actions, no institutions to provide accountability. There was only unlimited power exercised in complete secrecy, creating conditions where the unthinkable became routine and the monstrous became mundane. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Like all forms of moral corruption, It began with small compromises that gradually expanded into something unrecognizable. Former servants who later escaped the island described a progression that chilled even hardened Roman soldiers when they heard the accounts years later. At first, the emperor's behavior seemed merely eccentric. He would spend hours watching children swim in the villa's elaborate pool systems, claiming he found their innocence refreshing after decades of political cynicism. He commissioned artists to create increasingly explicit sculptures and paintings, justifying these additions as educational materials for understanding human nature. He began hosting private gatherings where entertainment grew progressively more disturbing, each event pushing boundaries that had seemed absolute just months before. But isolation has a way of accelerating moral decay, and Tiberius's appetites grew darker with each passing season. The children who had once simply provided companionship were gradually drawn into activities that stripped away their dignity piece by piece. What began as inappropriate touching evolved into systematic abuse that left psychological scars deeper than any physical wound. The emperor developed elaborate justifications for his behavior, drawing on philosophical traditions that spoke of the naturalness of desire and the rights of those with power to satisfy their needs. He surrounded himself with scholars and advisors who reinforced these twisted rationalizations, creating an echo chamber where the most depraved acts could be reframed as expressions of imperial privilege or even divine right. Ancient sources describe the villa's atmosphere during this period as suffocating with fear and corruption. Servants learned to avert their eyes and plug their ears, understanding that witnessing too much could mean death. The few visitors who were permitted access to the private areas returned to Rome changed, their faces bearing the haunted expression of those who had seen evil in its purest form. The children themselves became like ghosts haunting the marble corridors. Those who survived the initial trauma were transformed into hollow shells, their spirits broken so completely that resistance became impossible. They moved through the villa with the mechanical precision of wind-up toys, performing whatever was demanded of them while their eyes stared at nothing. Some of these young victims were as small as 2 or 3 years old, barely old enough to form memories, yet old enough to experience terror and pain. The emperor took particular pleasure in what he called training these youngest ones, teaching them behaviors that no child should ever know existed. The process was methodical and cruel, designed not just to satisfy his immediate desires, but to create a renewable source of entertainment that would never grow too old or independent to resist. The logistics of maintaining this system of abuse required an entire network of complicit adults. Villa staff were carefully selected for their willingness to participate in or ignore atrocities. Guards ensured that no unauthorized witnesses could document what occurred. Physicians were kept on hand to treat injuries that might otherwise prove fatal, preserving the emperor's playthings for continued use. Perhaps most chilling was the bureaucratic efficiency with which new victims were acquired and processed. Slave traders developed specialized routes to Capri, bringing shipments of children selected for specific physical characteristics. Families throughout the empire learned to hide their most attractive offspring when imperial agents came recruiting for the emperor's household. Even wealthy parents began to fear the kind of imperial attention that had once been considered an honor. The villa's design reflected this systematic approach to horror. Special chambers were constructed with features that facilitated abuse while minimizing the risk of detection. Soundproof rooms prevented screams from carrying to areas where they might be overheard by the wrong people. Hidden passages allowed the emperor to move between locations without being seen by visitors who might carry tales back to Rome. Underground areas housed children between their periods of service, keeping them isolated from each other and from any potential source of comfort or hope. These spaces were designed to break spirits as efficiently as possible, cold, dark, and filled with the constant sound of dripping water that gradually drove inhabitants toward madness. But it wasn't just the physical environment that served the emperor's twisted purposes. Tiberius understood that psychological manipulation could be more effective than brute force in ensuring compliance. He developed elaborate reward systems that gave victims the illusion of earning better treatment through cooperation, creating a perverted kind of hope that made resistance seem counterproductive. Children who pleased him received better food, warmer clothing, and small luxuries that seemed magnificent in the context of their deprivation. Those who resisted or displeased him faced punishments so severe that other victims learned to anticipate his moods and adjust their behavior accordingly. This system of intermittent reinforcement created a form of trauma bonding that made escape psychologically impossible, even when physical barriers might have been overcome. The emperor also used competition between victims as a tool of control. Children were forced to perform increasingly degrading acts in contests where the winner received privileges and the losers faced punishment. This approach not only provided entertainment for Tiberius, but also prevented the formation of bonds between victims that might have led to collective resistance or mutual support. Ancient historians struggled to document these practices because they challenged the very foundations of civilized society. Even in an age when slavery was commonplace and children had few legal protections, what occurred at Villa Jovis crossed lines that most Romans considered sacred. The systematic sexual exploitation of toddlers represented a level of depravity that shocked contemporaries, who were already accustomed to imperial excess. Yet the isolation of Capri meant that definitive proof of these activities remained elusive for years. Rumors circulated throughout the empire, growing more elaborate and disturbing with each retelling. But without witnesses willing to speak publicly or evidence that could be presented to official investigators, the emperor's crimes remained matters of whispered speculation rather than formal accusation. This uncertainty worked in Tiberius's favor, allowing him to dismiss criticism as the jealous fantasies of political enemies while continuing to expand the scope of his activities. He grew bolder in his exploitation, no longer content with simple abuse, but developing elaborate scenarios that combined sexual violence with psychological torture in ways that maximized both his pleasure and his victims' suffering. The children who endured these horrors developed survival mechanisms that revealed both human resilience and the devastating impact of systematic trauma. Some retreated so deeply into themselves that they became like living dolls, present in body but absent in spirit, moving through their daily torment with the mechanical precision of clockwork figures. Others developed a desperate cunning, learning to read the emperor's moods with supernatural accuracy and anticipating his desires before they were spoken. But perhaps most heartbreaking were those who retained enough of their original personalities to understand what was being done to them. These children would lie awake at night in their underground chambers, staring at stone ceilings and trying to remember faces from their previous lives. Mothers who had kissed their foreheads, fathers who had lifted them onto their shoulders, siblings who had shared their games and laughter. The emperor took particular satisfaction in these moments of recognition, when he could see in a child's eyes the exact moment they understood that their old life was gone forever. He would often force his youngest victims to describe their families, their homes, their dreams for the future, only to explain in meticulous detail why none of those things mattered anymore. This psychological cruelty served no purpose beyond his own entertainment, yet it became as routine as the physical abuse. Villa Jovis operated according to schedules and routines that gave structure to unthinkable chaos. Morning brought what the emperor called selection time, when he would choose which children would serve his needs that day and in what capacity. The selection process itself became a form of torture, as victims never knew whether they would be chosen for relatively mild humiliation or for experiences that might leave them permanently damaged. Afternoons were reserved for what Tiberius termed educational sessions, periods when new arrivals were trained in the behaviors expected of them. These training sessions were conducted by older victims who had been broken so completely that they now served as extensions of the emperor's will. The sight of children teaching other children how to submit to unspeakable acts represented perhaps the most complete victory of evil over innocence that human history has recorded. Evenings brought the elaborate entertainments that had become the villa's primary purpose. The emperor would recline on silk cushions, surrounded by artwork depicting scenes of exploitation, while children performed acts that defied description. Sometimes he would invite carefully selected guests to witness these spectacles, using their shocked reactions as an additional source of amusement. The guest list for these evening entertainments reveals the extent to which corruption had spread throughout the Roman elite. Provincial governors seeking imperial favor learned to express appreciation for displays that privately disgusted them. Wealthy merchants hoping for lucrative government contracts found themselves applauding atrocities they would never have imagined possible. Military commanders who had spent their careers protecting Roman citizens from barbarian threats discovered they were now witnessing barbarism that exceeded anything their enemies had ever conceived. These complicit witnesses became trapped in a web of shared guilt that ensured their silence. Having attended even one of the emperor's private entertainments made them accomplices to crimes that would have resulted in their own execution if revealed. Their presence at Villa Jovis created a network of powerful Romans who had every reason to suppress any investigation into the emperor's activities. The children themselves understood this dynamic instinctively, recognizing that the very people who might have been expected to protect them were instead invested in maintaining the system that exploited them. This realization completed their psychological destruction more effectively than any physical torture, convincing them that resistance was not only futile, but that the entire world had conspired against them. Some victims attempted escape despite the impossibility of success. The island's geography made flight nearly impossible. Steep cliffs dropped hundreds of feet into churning seas, while the few accessible beaches were constantly patrolled by guards who had been instructed to kill rather than capture runaways. But desperation drove some children to attempt the impossible, preferring death to continued abuse. Those who were recaptured faced punishments so severe that they served as lessons to every other potential escapee. The emperor understood that hope itself was his enemy, and he worked systematically to eliminate even the possibility of hope from his victims' minds. Failed escape attempts were punished not just with torture, but with elaborate displays of cruelty designed to break the spirits of witnesses as well as participants. One particularly horrific example involved a boy of perhaps 6 years old who had somehow managed to reach the villa's outer walls before being caught. Rather than simply executing him, Tiberius ordered that he be kept alive but subjected to increasingly creative forms of torment over a period of weeks. Other children were forced to watch these punishments, learning that death itself would not provide escape from the emperor's reach. The boy's suffering became a form of entertainment that the emperor shared with his guests, turning torture into dinner theatre. Ancient sources describe how the child's cries provided background music for philosophical discussions about the nature of power and the rights of rulers to satisfy their desires. The juxtaposition of intellectual sophistication and moral barbarism created an atmosphere so surreal that even hardened Roman aristocrats struggled to process what they were witnessing. But it wasn't just escape attempts that triggered the emperor's cruelty. Any sign of independence or retained humanity became grounds for punishment. Children who showed affection for each other were separated and forced to inflict pain on their former friends. Those who maintained hope or spoke of their families were subjected to treatments designed to erase every positive memory from their minds. The emperor developed what he called memory games, elaborate psychological tortures that forced children to relive traumatic experiences while being unable to seek comfort or support from others. These sessions could last for hours, with the emperor taking detailed notes on his victims' responses and refining his techniques based on what he learned. The villa's staff participated in these horrors with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but participation was never optional. Servants who showed reluctance were reminded that their own children could easily join the emperor's collection if their loyalty was questioned. This threat proved remarkably effective at ensuring compliance, creating a household where every adult had become complicit in the systematic destruction of innocence. The most disturbing aspect of this staff complicity was how quickly normal people adapted to abnormal circumstances. Servants who had once been horrified by what they witnessed gradually became numb to atrocities that would have driven them to suicide in their former lives. They developed their own psychological defense mechanisms, treating the children as objects rather than human beings to make their participation bearable. Kitchen staff prepared elaborate meals while ignoring the sounds of suffering that echoed through the villa's corridors. Groundskeepers maintained beautiful gardens, where children were displayed like living sculptures for the emperor's amusement. Household administrators kept meticulous records of which victims were used for what purposes, treating human trafficking with the same bureaucratic efficiency they applied to managing wine inventories. This normalization of evil represented perhaps Tiberius's greatest of individual lives, but the corruption crime, not just the destruction of an entire community of adults who had once possessed normal human consciences. The emperor had created a pocket of hell where good people became monsters simply by accepting their circumstances rather than choosing death over complicity. The children born into this environment never knew any other reality, which created psychological damage that extended beyond even what the captured victims experienced. These villa-born children grew up believing that abuse was natural, that their bodies existed solely for others' pleasure, and that resistance to authority was not just futile, but literally unthinkable. Ancient historians noted that these villa-born victims were in some ways the most disturbing to encounter, because they displayed no signs of trauma or distress. They had been so completely shaped by their environment that they found normalcy in situations that would drive ordinary children insane. Their calm acceptance of unspeakable treatment served as a mirror reflecting the depth of corruption that Tiberius had achieved. The emperor took particular pride in these perfectly conditioned victims, viewing them as proof of his ability to reshape human nature itself. He would display them to visitors as examples of what proper training could accomplish, explaining in clinical detail how he had molded their personalities to serve his needs. These presentations combined the pride of an artist displaying masterworks with the satisfaction of a farmer showing prize livestock. But even in this environment of systematic horror, fragments of human dignity occasionally surfaced in ways that revealed the indestructible nature of the human spirit. Children would sometimes risk severe punishment to comfort each other during moments of particular trauma. Small acts of kindness passed between victims like underground streams of hope flowing beneath a landscape of despair. These moments of connection terrified the emperor more than any escape attempt, because they reminded him that he had not achieved the complete control over human nature that he believed was his due. When discovered, these displays of mutual care were punished with extraordinary brutality, but they continued to emerge despite the risks involved. The emperor's growing paranoia about these connections led him to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of surveillance and control. He installed hidden viewing chambers throughout the villa, allowing him to spy on his victims during their few moments of supposed privacy. What he discovered in these observations became the basis for new forms of punishment and psychological manipulation. Children learned to perform even their private moments, understanding that genuine emotion or authentic connection would result in consequences too terrible to contemplate. They developed elaborate codes of behavior that appeared to comply with the emperor's demands, while preserving tiny spaces of mental freedom that remained their own. This constant performance of submission, while maintaining hidden reserves of selfhood, required enormous psychological strength and created internal tensions that manifested in ways the emperor found endlessly fascinating. He began to see his victims' suffering as a form of art, and their psychological destruction as his greatest creative achievement. The villa became a laboratory where Tiberius experimented with the limits of human endurance and the mechanisms of psychological control. He kept detailed records of his findings, creating what amounted to manuals of torture and manipulation that would have been invaluable to future tyrants had they survived the eventual collapse of his regime. These records reveal a mind that had moved far beyond simple sadism into realms of systematic evil that challenged contemporary understanding of human nature itself. The emperor had become something new in human experience, not just a monster, but a methodical student of monstrosity who treated cruelty as a science to be perfected through careful observation and experimentation. Ancient sources struggle to convey the full scope of what occurred at Villa Jovis because the crimes committed there exceeded the vocabulary of moral condemnation available to even the most sophisticated writers of the age. They resort to euphemisms and indirect references, leaving modern readers to piece together the full picture from fragments of testimony that were too disturbing to record in complete detail. Yet even these incomplete accounts paint a picture of systematic evil that rivals anything in human history. The emperor had created a sustainable system for the industrial-scale destruction of innocents, complete with supply chains, training programs, and quality control measures designed to maximize both efficiency and cruelty. The children trapped in this system faced a future that offered no hope of rescue or redemption. Those who survived their initial abuse were gradually shaped into instruments of further abuse, their own suffering becoming the foundation for inflicting suffering on others. The cycle of victimization became self-perpetuating, creating a closed system where evil generated more evil with mathematical precision. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire operation was how completely it had been hidden from the outside world. While rumors circulated throughout the empire, the emperor's crimes remained largely invisible to the very society whose values and institutions he was systematically destroying. The isolation of Capri had created a space where the unthinkable could occur without consequence, where the most powerful man on earth could indulge his darkest fantasies while maintaining his public image as a respected leader. The horror of Villa Jovis wasn't contained to its marble walls. It rippled outward through the empire in ways that few contemporaries understood. Word began to reach Rome not through official channels, but through the broken whispers of survivors who had somehow escaped the island's clutches. These accounts arrived fragmented and traumatized, told by former servants whose minds had been shattered by what they'd witnessed, or by the rare child who had grown old enough to be discarded and somehow found passage back to the mainland. But these testimonies faced a conspiracy of silence that extended far beyond the villa itself. Too many powerful Romans had visited Capri, had participated in or witnessed the emperor's entertainments, had compromised themselves beyond any possibility of speaking out. Senators who might have demanded investigations found themselves remembering their own visits to the island, their own moments of weakness when they had chosen complicity over conscience. The few brave souls who attempted to document these crimes discovered that truth itself had become a dangerous commodity in Tiberius's empire. Scribes who recorded testimony from survivors often disappeared within days, their writings confiscated by imperial agents who claimed to be investigating sedition rather than protecting victims. Witnesses learned to speak in coded language, if they spoke at all, understanding that direct accusations would result in their own destruction. This systematic suppression of evidence created a perfect storm of institutional failure. The very people charged with protecting Roman citizens from imperial excess, the senators, the governors, the military commanders, had become invested in maintaining the emperor's secrets. They transformed from potential saviors into active participants in the cover-up, their silence purchased with their own guilt. Meanwhile, on Capri itself, the horror was reaching new depths. as Tiberius grew bolder in his experimentation. The emperor had begun to view his crimes not as aberrations, but as innovations, convinced that he was pushing the boundaries of human experience into unexplored territories. He spoke to his closest confidants about transcending conventional morality, about achieving a form of godlike freedom that lesser mortals could never understand. This philosophical framework allowed him to rationalize increasingly elaborate cruelties as expressions of divine will rather than human depravity. He commissioned scholars to write treatises justifying his behavior, creating an intellectual foundation for atrocities that challenged the very concept of civilization itself. These documents, carefully preserved in the villa's libraries, represented perhaps the most systematic attempt in human history to provide academic legitimacy for the sexual exploitation of children. The emperor's appetite for innovation led him to develop what he called educational programs for his youngest victims. Children as young as 2 years old were subjected to training regimens designed to prepare them for increasingly specific forms of abuse. These programs operated with the efficiency of military academies, complete with curricula, performance evaluations, and advancement criteria that measured success by the degree of degradation achieved. Tiberius died in 37 AD, taking his secrets with him to a grave that offered no peace to the countless children whose lives he had destroyed. The villa on Capri was abandoned, its marble halls eventually crumbling into ruins that tourists now visit without understanding the horrors those stones once witnessed. But the emperor's true legacy isn't found in the architectural remains of his palace. It's written in the shadows of history, in the whispered testimonies that ancient historians could barely bring themselves to record, and in the reminder that absolute power doesn't just corrupt absolutely, it transforms human beings into something that defies comprehension. The children who suffered in those marble corridors are long dead, their names forgotten, their voices silenced by an empire that chose complicity over justice. Yet their story echoes across the centuries as a warning that civilization's greatest monuments are often built upon foundations of unimaginable suffering, and that the price of looking away from evil is always paid by those who have no choice but to endure it.